The shackles felt cold against Margaret Derry's wrists, but she had stopped shaking an hour ago. Fear had a way of burning itself out when you had nothing left to lose. She walked between two armed guards down a corridor that smelled like disinfectant and something else. Something organic and wrong. After 43 years of nursing, she knew the smell of suffering when it hit her nostrils. The station hummed around them, a deep vibration that came from the massive engines keeping this metal prison anchored in orbit around a dying star. Through occasional windows, she could see the star's red glow painting everything in shades of rust and blood. Appropriate, she thought. This whole place ran on blood. Margaret was 67 years old. Her back hurt most mornings. Her hands had begun to shake slightly when she held instruments too long. She wore reading glasses now, something that had annoyed her to no end when she first needed them. None of that mattered anymore. In approximately 10 minutes, she would be dead. The tribunal had lasted 3 hours. 3 hours to decide that 43 years of service meant nothing. They said she killed 3 soldiers, young men who had survived an alien pathogen only to die under her care. They showed pictures of the bodies. They read testimonies from doctors who had never met her. They presented evidence that looked real enough to convince anyone who wanted to believe it. What they did not mention was why those soldiers had really died. What they did not say was that Margaret had found contaminated equipment in the quarantine ward, that she had reported it, that she had asked questions about why patients were receiving experimental treatments without consent. The military did not appreciate questions. The military especially did not appreciate questions about their secret projects, so they made her the villain. It was cleaner that way. The guards stopped at a reinforced door. One of them, a young woman with a fresh scar across her cheek, looked at Margaret with something that might have been pity. The other guard, older and tired, just stared straight ahead. He had probably done this before. Last words? The older guard asked. It was procedure, Margaret knew. Everything here was procedure. My medical bag, Margaret said. Can you throw it in with me? The guard frowned. Why would you want that? Margaret smiled, a real smile that made the corners of her eyes crinkle. Old habits. I have never gone anywhere without it. The young guard with the scar went to retrieve the bag from the holding area. Margaret had been allowed to keep it until now, a strange mercy that she had not questioned. It contained basic supplies, nothing that could be used as a weapon. Just bandages, antiseptic, some painkillers, a few syringes, the tools of her trade. The door opened with a hiss of pressurizing air. Beyond it, Margaret could see a massive chamber, easily 50 meters across and 30 meters high. The environment inside looked hostile, kept at a different atmosphere than the rest of the station. Heat shimmered in waves. The lighting was dim, reddish like the star outside. Cell 7, the older guard announced as if Margaret did not already know. Everyone on the station knew about Cell 7. It was where they put the worst of the worst. It was where they sent people to die. The creature has not been fed in 6 days, the young guard said quietly. She was not supposed to say that, Margaret could tell. It was a kindness, a warning. It will be fast, Margaret nodded. Fast was good. She had seen slow deaths, had held hands through them, had whispered comfort to people whose bodies were failing piece by piece. Fast was a gift. They pushed her forward, not roughly, and she stepped through the door. The young guard tossed her medical bag in after her. It landed with a soft thump a few meters away. Then the door sealed shut with a finality that Margaret felt in her chest. The heat hit her immediately. It had to be at least 40 degrees in here, maybe more. Sweat began to form on her forehead. The air tasted metallic, rich with minerals. She could hear her own breathing, loud in the sudden silence. Margaret picked up her bag and straightened. If she was going to die, she would die standing up. That was when she saw it. The Draconite was chained to the far wall. Massive restraints bolted into the metal floor and ceiling. The creature was enormous, easily 4 meters tall, even in its hunched position. Its scales were deep amber in color, darkening to almost black along the ridge of its spine. Wings, tattered and torn, hung limp from its shoulders. Its head was long and angular, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Margaret had seen pictures, of course. Everyone had. The Draconites were the enemy, the monsters that humanity had fought during the Scorched Arm conflict. Vicious, deadly, responsible for thousands of human deaths. That was what the report said, but the reports had not mentioned the wounds. The creature's side was torn open, a massive gash that wept fluid. Smaller wounds covered its body, some fresh, some infected. The chains had rubbed its scales raw in places, exposing tissue underneath. One wing looked deliberately broken, bones jutting at wrong angles. Margaret's medical training took over before her fear could stop her. She had seen torture before in war zones and places where humans did terrible things to each other. This was the same. This was worse. The Draconite's eyes fixed on her. They were intelligent eyes, not the mindless gaze of a beast. They were filled with pain and something else. Resignation, maybe? Or curiosity. They sent another one, the creature said. Margaret nearly dropped her bag. The voice was deep, resonant, but the words were perfect. Human language, spoken with only the slightest accent. "You can talk," Margaret whispered. "I am a scholar," the Draconite said. "Or I was before your kind destroyed my world. I speak 7 languages. I have read your philosophers. I know your history better than most humans." The creature shifted slightly and chains clinked. "My name is Iskar. You are the 5th human they have thrown to me this year. You will be the 5th I do not kill." Margaret stared. 5 people, 5 executions that had not happened. What happened to them? "They died anyway," Iskar said. "Fear stops the heart as surely as claws. 3 died within hours. 1 lasted 2 days, cowering in that corner. The last one threw himself at the door until his skull cracked." The Draconite's eyes dimmed slightly. "I tried to tell them I meant no harm. They could not hear me through their terror." Margaret took a step forward. Then another. Her fear was still there, alive in her chest, but her purpose was stronger. She had been a nurse for over 4 decades. She had treated criminals and saints, humans and aliens, soldiers and civilians. She had never refused care to anyone who needed it. "That wound on your side," she said, her voice steady now. "How long have you had it?" Iskar tilted his head, a gesture that looked almost bird-like. 3 months. The guards use shock weapons. They find it entertaining." "It is infected," Margaret said. She was close enough now to smell it. The sickly sweet odor of rot. "Without treatment, you will die from sepsis." "I know," Iskar said. "I have been dying slowly for 5 years." Margaret set down her bag and opened it. Her hands did not shake. "Not today," she said. Iskar watched the old human approach with cleaning supplies in her weathered hands. In 5 years of captivity, no one had come close to him without weapons or restraints. No one had looked at him and seen anything except a monster. Yet this small, gray-haired woman moved toward him with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a patient, not a predator. "This will hurt," Margaret said, examining the wound on his side. She did not flinch at the smell or the sight of exposed tissue. "I need to clean out the infection before I can close it properly." "Pain is an old companion," Iskar replied. "Do what you must." She began to work, and Iskar discovered that he had lied. This pain was different from the casual cruelty of guards with shock weapons. This pain had purpose. Margaret's movements were efficient, practiced. She cut away dead tissue with steady hands, flushed the wound with antiseptic that burned like fire, packed it with gauze that she changed 3 times before she was satisfied. Through it all, she talked. Not to him exactly, but not to herself either. She narrated what she was doing, explaining each step in a calm, measured voice. It reminded Iskar of the teaching songs his clutch mother used to sing, back when his world still existed. "The human body fights infection with white blood cells," Margaret said as she worked. "I assume your biology has something similar, given that you are clearly trying to heal. The problem is that the wound is too large and too dirty. Your immune system is overwhelmed. We need to give it a fighting chance." "You are wasting supplies," Iskar said. "They will not give you more." "They think I am dead," Margaret replied. "Or soon will be. These supplies are wasted either way." She finished with the large wound and moved to the smaller ones. There were dozens of them scattered across his body like a map of suffering. She cleaned each one methodically, her face set in concentration. When she reached the raw wounds where the chains had rubbed his scales away, her expression tightened. "This is deliberate," she said quietly. "The chains are designed to cause maximum pain." "Yes," Iskar confirmed. "The station commander believes that pain makes prisoners more cooperative. She is incorrect, but she is very committed to her beliefs." Margaret looked up at him. In the red-tinged light of the cell, her eyes seemed darker than they probably were. "What did you do to end up here?" "I killed 3 guards," Iskar said. He saw her stiffen slightly but continue working. "They were torturing a phosphor prisoner in the cell next to mine. The phosphor are a gentle species, incapable of violence. Their screams went on for 6 hours. When the guards came to my cell for their daily entertainment, I was no longer in a merciful mood. Entertainment, Margaret repeated, her voice flat. They place bets, Iskar explained, on how long we can endure before we break, on whether we will beg in our own languages or theirs, on what sounds we make. He paused. The phosphor died the next day. I have been labeled as Rabbit ever since, a killing machine useful only for executions. Margaret finished treating the last visible wound. She sat back on her heels, studying him. Can you kill? She asked. Your species, I mean. Are you capable of it? It was a question no human had ever asked him before. They simply assumed. Draconites are biologically restricted, Iskar said. We can only kill in immediate self-defense when we are being directly attacked. Even then, it requires a conscious override of deep instincts. The act causes us severe psychological trauma. We feel the death of the creature we kill as if it were our own. He looked at his clawed hands. I still feel those 3 guards dying. I will feel it until my own death releases me. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, the war. The Scorched Arm conflict. The report said your people massacred human colonies. The reports lied, Iskar said simply. Humanity discovered that our worlds contained deposits of element 07, a mineral essential for your faster-than-light drives. We offered to trade. Your military decided that genocide was cheaper than negotiation. He gestured around the cell with one chained hand. This station, this research facility, it is built on the ruins of our 3rd moon. My clutchmates died in the bombardment. I survived because I was off-world, attending an academic conference on your colony of New Geneva. Element 07, Margaret murmured. We called it the Prosperity Initiative. They said it would revolutionize space travel. It did, Iskar said. Your ships travel twice as fast now. All it cost was 17 billion Draconite lives. Margaret's hands had stopped moving. She stared at nothing for a long moment, her face pale even in the red light. Then she opened her medical bag again and pulled out ration bars, the kind given to prisoners. You said you have not been fed. I am used to hunger. Eat anyway, Margaret said, unwrapping 3 bars and setting them within his reach. You cannot heal without fuel. Iskar had not tasted real food in 6 days. The ration bars were bland, designed for human metabolism, but his body accepted them gratefully. He ate slowly, aware that eating too quickly would make him sick. Why were you sent here? He asked between bites. What crime did you commit? Margaret smiled, but there was no humor in it. I asked questions. I found evidence of illegal medical experiments. 3 patients under my care died from contaminated equipment, and I reported it. The military did not appreciate that. So they made you a murderer? Yes. Margaret began repacking her medical supplies. It is easier to discredit the messenger than address the message. I have seen it before, but I had hoped humanity was better than this. I was wrong. Not entirely wrong, Iskar said. You are here. You are human. One person does not redeem a species. No, Iskar agreed. But one person can make a difference to one other person. You have given me something I had forgotten existed. What is that? Hope that not all humans are monsters. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and Iskar saw the moment when she made a decision. It was visible in the set of her shoulders, the lift of her chin. The cameras, she said quietly. How much can they see? Everything, Iskar replied. The guards watch executions. They record them. Sometimes they sell the recordings to other stations as entertainment. But they are not always watching, Margaret pressed. They cannot be. This station must have hundreds of cells, thousands of prisoners. They cannot monitor everything constantly. Iskar understood what she was asking. There are blind spots, he said carefully. The cameras are mounted in fixed positions. The area directly beneath each camera cannot be seen. Neither can the spaces behind the structural supports near the door. How long have you been studying the cameras? 5 years, Iskar said. I have counted every rivet in this cell. I have memorized every patrol schedule, every guard rotation, every maintenance cycle. Knowledge is the only freedom I have left. Margaret moved to one of the blind spots, a shadowed area behind a support beam. Iskar shifted as much as his chains allowed, angling his body to partially obscure her from view. To the cameras, it would look like he was simply moving in his restraints. To anyone watching, Margaret would appear to be cowering in the corner. Tell me about this station, Margaret said from her hidden position. Tell me everything you know. So Iskar told her. He told her about the 300 prisoners held in the lower levels, species from across the galaxy that humanity had conquered or was planning to conquer. He told her about the laboratories on the upper decks where scientists worked on biological weapons. He told her about the staff, the rotations, the security measures, and the weaknesses he had observed. Most importantly, he told her about what this station really was. Not a prison, not even a research facility, not truly. This was a production center for weapons of genocide, using living beings as raw materials. The experiments conducted here had already been deployed on 6 worlds. Billions dead, entire species reduced to scattered survivors, and humanity's expansion continued unchecked. They are using your DNA, Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Draconite regenerative properties. They mentioned it in my trial, said they were developing new medical treatments, but that is not what this is. No, Iskar confirmed. They are weaponizing it, creating pathogens that cause uncontrolled cellular growth, cancers that spread through physical contact, plagues that leave technology intact while killing all biological life. He paused. The pathogen that killed your 3 soldiers was a test. They released it deliberately to see if their containment protocols were sufficient. The protocols failed. Rather than admit the failure, they blamed you. Margaret was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet and very cold. How many others know the truth? About the experiments? Only the senior staff and the station commander, General Iris Hawthorne. She personally oversees the weapons program. Then we have a problem, Margaret said, because now I know. And I am already dead, which means I have nothing left to lose. She stepped out from the blind spot, her medical bag in hand. Starting tomorrow, you are going to teach me everything you know about this station. And I am going to figure out how to make sure the truth does not die with us. Iskar felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. Purpose. For 5 years he had simply endured, surviving because dying would dishonor his lost clutchmates. But now perhaps there was a reason to do more than simply survive. You understand that escape is nearly impossible, he said. I have planned it 1,000 times in my mind. The obstacles are immense. Margaret smiled, and this time there was warmth in it. Good thing I am a nurse, then. We specialize in keeping impossible cases alive. 3 weeks passed in Cell 7, and Margaret Derry learned to become invisible. The guards expected her to be dead, so she played dead. She lay in the blind spots during their patrols, motionless, her gray hair and pale skin blending with the metal floor. From the camera angles, she looked like a discarded corpse that Iskar had pushed aside. The guards never came close enough to check. Why would they? Everyone knew what happened in Cell 7. While they thought she was dead, Margaret was learning to survive. Iskar showed her which areas of the cell were coolest, where condensation gathered that she could drink, how to ration the small amounts of food that came with his irregular feeding schedule. He ate less so she could eat more, though she protested every time. I am larger, he said simply. I can endure hunger better. This is mathematics, not sacrifice. But Margaret knew sacrifice when she saw it, and she worked harder because of it. During sleep cycles, when the station's lighting dimmed and guard patrols decreased, Margaret moved through the ventilation shafts. The ducts were old, designed for a smaller station before expansions had tripled the facility's size. Maintenance had become lax in the outer sections. Margaret was small and flexible for her age, and desperation made her brave. She mapped the station level by level. The ventilation system connected everything, a secret highway through the station's bones. She learned which ducts were monitored, which were forgotten, where she could move safely and where cameras would catch her. Iskar had given her the theoretical knowledge, but Margaret turned theory into practical reality. On the 23rd night of her supposed death, Margaret found the laboratories. She had known they existed. Iskar had told her the location, the layout, what to expect. But knowing was different from seeing. Margaret crouched in a ventilation duct above Lab 4 and watched through the grating as scientists in clean suits worked on creatures strapped to tables. Some of the creatures were still alive, some were not. The scientists did not seem to care about the difference. Margaret forced herself to watch. She forced herself to memorize. Later, back in Cell 7, she would tell Iskar everything in precise detail. He would remember it perfectly, his eidetic memory cataloging every atrocity. But first she had to witness it without looking away. In Lab 4 they were working on a silicate, a being made of living crystalline structures. The scientists were testing how much of its body could be removed before the silicate's consciousness fragmented. They took notes on data pads while the creature's colors flickered through patterns that Margaret somehow knew meant screaming, even though no sound emerged. In Lab 6 they were breeding pathogens in the bodies of small mammalian aliens Margaret did not recognize. The creatures were conscious during the process, strapped in place while viruses rewrote their cellular structures from the inside out. In Lab 2 she found the draconite DNA samples, rows and rows of them, harvested from Iskar and others like him. The log notes were clinical. Sample DR7 showed a 34% increase in regeneration when subjected to radiation. Sample DR12 survived complete organ removal for 16 hours. Sample DR23 expired during extraction. Margaret had seen war. She had treated soldiers who had committed atrocities and soldiers who had suffered them. She had held the hands of dying children in field hospitals. She thought she understood the depths to which humans could sink. She had been wrong. She crawled back through the ventilation system, moving on autopilot, her mind struggling to process what she had seen. When she finally dropped back into Cell 7, landing with less grace than usual, Iskar was waiting in the blind spot. "You saw," he said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded. She could not speak yet. "I am sorry," Iskar said quietly. "I wish you had not needed to see it. I wish I could have spared you that knowledge." "How many?" Margaret finally asked. "How many species have they done this to?" 47 that I know of," Iskar replied. "Some are extinct now. Some have only a handful of survivors left. Some do not even know what happened to their missing people." Margaret sat down heavily. Her hands were shaking again, but not from age or illness. From rage, pure clean rage that burned away the shock and left clarity in its wake. "I found the computer core," she said. "Or at least I found the access terminals. Lab 2 has direct connections to the station's main database. Can you access it?" "Not yet, but I will." Margaret looked up at Iskar. "I also found other prisoners, the ones you told me about. I could not reach them, but I saw them. A silicate in Lab 4, those small furry ones in Lab 6, a huge gray creature in a cell 3 levels down. The Titanid," Iskar said. "His name is Granite. He was a cargo loader before the humans decided his species was too close to their shipping lanes. They sterilized his homeworld with biological weapons, then captured the survivors for testing. Can we reach him? If you can move through the ducts, you can reach any cell in the lower levels. But communication will be difficult. The Titanids use chemical signals to speak." Margaret stood up, her resolve hardening. "Then we find another way. We make signs, we draw pictures, we figure it out." She paced the length of the blind spot. "We cannot do this alone, Iskar. Even if I could free you, even if we could somehow escape this cell, we would never make it off the station. We need allies. We need numbers. You need an army," Iskar said. "No, I need patience." Margaret smiled grimly. "Patients work together to survive. They know that healing requires cooperation. An army follows orders, but patients fight for themselves and each other. That is what we need." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret made contact. It was slow, dangerous work. She could only move during sleep cycles. She had to avoid patrols, dodge surveillance, and learn the patterns of a station designed to prevent exactly what she was attempting. But she had advantages. She was old, overlooked, presumed dead. She moved like a ghost through systems that no longer monitored her. The silicate engineer, who Margaret learned was named Crystal, communicated by changing the patterns of light within her body. Margaret learned basic signals. Yes, no. Danger. Wait. The Titanid Granite. Understood drawings. Margaret sketched plans on stolen data pads showing him what she needed. He was slow to trust, but when he saw that Margaret came back night after night risking discovery, he began to believe. The small mammalian creatures in Lab 6 were called phosphors. They could manipulate light, bending it to create images in the air. Through them, Margaret met Navigator, the phosphor who had died in the cell next to Iskar. They had named themselves after him, carrying his memory forward. Navigator showed Margaret the patterns of guard movements, translated into pure light and shadow. Margaret also modified medical sensors, ones she stole from maintenance closets and reprogrammed using terminals in the labs. She created a communication network, a way for prisoners to send simple signals to each other through the station's own monitoring systems. The guards would see only normal readings. The prisoners would see messages of hope. But the most important discovery came in Lab 2, when Margaret finally cracked the access codes to the main database. She did it the old-fashioned way, watching a researcher enter his password through the ventilation grate, memorizing each keystroke. The researcher had been careless, confident that no one was watching. Everyone was always watching. Prisoners knew that lesson well. The database contained everything, every experiment, every casualty, every order from General Iris Hawthorne herself. And most damning of all, the evidence that Margaret had been searching for. The contaminated equipment in the quarantine ward had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate test of an airborne pathogen, designed to see if it could spread through human populations. The 3 soldiers under Margaret's care had been test subjects, their deaths carefully calculated. Margaret downloaded it all onto stolen data chips, each one small enough to hide in the seams of her clothing. She made copies and hid them throughout the station, in ventilation ducts, behind panels, inside equipment casings. If she was caught, if she died before this was finished, the evidence would remain. Someone would find it eventually. Back in Cell 7, she showed Iskar what she had found. He read the data in silence, his luminous eyes dimming and brightening as he processed the information. "This is enough," he said finally. "This evidence could bring down the entire military command structure. If it reaches civilian networks, if the galaxy sees what humanity has done, there will be a reckoning." "Getting it out is the problem," Margaret said. "The station has broadcast capabilities, but they are locked down tight. We would need to reach the communication center, bypass security, and transmit everything before they could stop us." "You would need a distraction," Iskar said slowly. "Something large enough to draw all available security forces away from critical systems." "A prison riot," Margaret said. "A mass escape attempt. Most prisoners would die in the attempt." "Most prisoners are already dead," Margaret replied quietly. "They just have not stopped breathing yet. At least this way, they die fighting for something. They die making sure the truth survives even if they do not." Iskar was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There is something you should know. About my chains. They are quantum locked to my biology. Only I can release them, and only if I am at full strength. The guards keep me weak deliberately to prevent this." Margaret understood immediately. "You need to heal. Completely heal. Yes, and I need real food, not these rations. I need proteins and minerals that my body can actually use." He looked at her. "Can you get them?" "I can get anything," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "Tell me what you need." So began the final phase of their preparation. Margaret stole food from the station's mess halls, targeting dishes that contained what Iskar needed. She sabotaged his suppression field during maintenance cycles, giving him windows of time when his natural healing could work unimpeded. She treated his wounds daily, changed his bandages, monitored his recovery with professional precision. And slowly, over 6 weeks, Iskar grew stronger. His scales regained their luster. His wounds closed and scarred. His wings, though still damaged, began to respond to his movements. The guards noticed nothing because they never looked closely. To them, Iskar was just another monster in a cage, and monsters did not change. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The radiation sickness started small. Margaret noticed it first as fatigue that rest could not cure, then as nausea that came in waves. She had been exposing herself to the hostile environment of Cell 7 for nearly 3 months now, and her body was paying the price. The cell's atmosphere was designed for draconite biology, rich in minerals that were toxic to humans in sustained doses. She hid the symptoms from Iskar as long as she could. She could not hide the bruising. Dark purple marks appeared on her arms where blood vessels were breaking down under her skin. When Iskar saw them during a medical check, he stopped moving entirely. "How long?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Margaret," she sighed. 4 weeks, maybe 5. The symptoms started about 2 weeks ago." "You are dying." "We are all dying," Margaret replied, applying fresh bandages to a nearly healed wound on his shoulder. "I am just on a faster schedule." "It changes nothing." "It changes everything," Iskar said. "You cannot continue this way. The ventilation crawls, the exposure to this environment, the stress. You are killing yourself." "Probably," Margaret agreed. "But I am going to finish this first." She looked at him directly. "I have lived 67 years. Most of them were good. I helped people. I raised a daughter who became a teacher. I loved a man who loved me back. I have no regrets about how I lived. But I have a lot of regrets about how humanity has acted, and I can do something about that. So I will. Iskar made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You are the strangest human I have ever met. I am the only human you have met who was not trying to kill you, Margaret pointed out. That probably lowers the bar considerably. Over the next week, Margaret worked faster. She knew her time was limited, so she pushed herself harder. She made final contacts with the prisoners, confirming roles and timing. Crystal would sabotage the power grid in Section 7. Granite would break through the reinforced walls between the lower cells once the suppression fields failed. Navigator would guide prisoners through the corridors using light patterns, avoiding guard positions. Margaret also began recording. Using a salvaged audio device, she documented everything she had seen, everything she knew, every piece of evidence she had collected. She recorded names of the scientists, dates of experiments, locations of mass graves on nearby moons where failed test subjects were dumped. She spoke clearly despite her growing weakness, making sure every word was understandable. My name is Margaret Derry, she said into the device during one late-night session in the ventilation ducts. I was a nurse for the Human Medical Corps for 43 years. I am recording this on October 23rd, year 2847, aboard Station Nightfall, orbiting star designation Red 7. If you are hearing this, I am already dead, but the truth does not die with me. She hid copies of the recordings with the data chips, creating redundancies upon redundancies. The truth would survive. She would make sure of it. On the 74th day of her captivity, Margaret made her final trip through the station. She visited each prisoner she had contacted, confirming they understood the plan. The escape would happen in 3 days, during the shift change at dawn cycle. It was when the station was most vulnerable, when tired guards were being replaced by fresh ones and communication was at its poorest. She also visited Lab 2 one last time. Using the stolen access codes, she set up an automated broadcast sequence. When triggered, it would transmit every piece of evidence to civilian networks across human space and to the Galactic Council beyond. The transmission would be unstoppable once started, broadcasting on every available frequency. The station could shut down its communication array, but not before significant data had already escaped. Margaret left the lab and began the long crawl back to Cell 7. Halfway there, her arms gave out. She lay in the ventilation duct, breathing hard, her body refusing to cooperate. The bruising had spread across her torso now. She was bleeding internally, slowly but inevitably. Not yet, she whispered to herself. Not yet. 3 more days. Just 3 more days. She forced herself to move. Inch by inch, she crawled through the ducts, each movement an exercise in willpower. When she finally dropped into Cell 7, she collapsed. Iskar caught her before she hit the ground. You should not have gone tonight, he said, carrying her to the blind spot. You are too weak. Had to, Margaret gasped. Final checks. Everyone is ready. Everyone except you. Margaret smiled weakly. I will be ready when it matters. Iskar laid her down gently. He had no medical supplies to offer her, no way to ease her pain. All he could do was keep watch while she rested. Tell me about your family, he said after a while. You mentioned a daughter. Patricia, Margaret said. She teaches history to middle school students on New Terra, probably telling them about the glorious human expansion into space, about how we brought civilization to the galaxy. She closed her eyes. I hope someday she learns the truth. I hope she understands why I did this. She will, Iskar said. When this is over, when the evidence is broadcast, everyone will know what you sacrificed. Maybe. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What about you? You said you had clutchmates. Tell me about them. So Iskar talked. He told her about growing up on the 3rd moon of Draconite Prime, about the teaching halls where young Draconites learned the harmonic scale. He talked about his clutch brother Stone, who could sing frequencies that made crystals grow in beautiful patterns, about his clutch sister Wind, who had been studying stellar formation before the bombs fell. We were going to write a paper together, Iskar said, about the correlation between solar wind patterns and planetary development. It seems silly now, caring about academic papers when entire worlds burn, but at the time it was the most important thing in existence. It is not silly, Margaret said. It is what makes life worth living. The small things, the projects, the dreams. Humanity forgot that. We got so focused on expansion and resources that we forgot we were supposed to be building something worth having. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Margaret slept more than she was awake, her body shutting down in stages, but when she was conscious, she was sharp, focused. She went over the plan with Iskar repeatedly, making sure he understood every detail. When Crystal cuts the power, you will have approximately 90 seconds before backup generators engage, she said. That is your window. You break your chains and get to the door. I have disabled the lock mechanism. It will open with minimal force. What about you? Iskar asked. I will be right behind you. Margaret. I will be right behind you, she repeated firmly. I did not come this far to miss the ending. The night before the escape, Margaret could not sleep. She sat in the blind spot, her stolen data pad in hand, and wrote a letter to her daughter. She did not know if Patricia would ever read it, but she wrote it anyway. Dear Patricia, she began. By the time you read this, you will know what I have done. You will probably hear terrible things about me. They will say I was a traitor, that I sided with monsters against my own species. I want you to know the truth. I sided with patience against a system that had lost its humanity. There is a difference, and it matters. I love you. I am proud of you. Teach your students to ask questions, even uncomfortable ones, especially uncomfortable ones. That is how we stay human. Love, Mom. She sent the letter into the station's outgoing mail queue, set to transmit after the broadcast began. Then she deleted all traces of her presence from the computer systems. Ghost protocols, making sure that if the military tried to track her movements, they would find nothing. Let them wonder. Let them fear. On the morning of the 77th day, Margaret woke to find Iskar watching her. It is time, he said. Margaret nodded and stood. Her legs shook, but they held. She had saved 3 stims for this moment. Medical-grade stimulants that would give her a few hours of artificial energy. She injected them into her arm, feeling the chemicals flood her system. Her heart rate increased. The fog in her mind cleared. The pain receded to a distant murmur.
How do I look?
She asked. Like someone who will not surrender, Iskar replied. Good enough. They moved to their positions. Margaret crouched near the door, out of sight of the cameras. Iskar stood at the center of his chains, every muscle tensed. They waited as the minutes ticked down. At exactly 0600 hours, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the entire station plunged into darkness. Crystal had done her part. Margaret heard Iskar's chains snap, the quantum locks releasing as his full strength surged through them. The metal links shattered like glass. In the darkness, she heard his wings unfold, heard the whisper of scales against metal. Then the backup generators kicked in, bathing the cell in emergency red lighting. Iskar stood unchained for the first time in 5 years. He looked at his hands, at his broken wings, at the open space around him. Then he looked at Margaret. Thank you, he said. Thank me when we finish this, Margaret replied. She moved to the door, which groaned open as Iskar pushed it. Now let us go free some prisoners and burn down a research station. Alarms began to wail throughout the facility. In cells across 3 levels, prisoners felt their suppression fields fail. They heard the sound of granite smashing through reinforced walls. They saw navigators' light patterns showing them the way to freedom. The uprising had begun. Station nightfall descended into controlled chaos within minutes of the power failure. Guards rushed through corridors, shock weapons charged and ready, following emergency protocols that assumed a simple malfunction. They had not trained for a coordinated uprising because such a thing was supposed to be impossible. Prisoners were kept isolated, communication was monitored, and the suppression fields prevented any creature from using their natural abilities. But the suppression fields were offline, and prisoners who had been powerless for years suddenly remembered what they could do. Crystal moved through the corridors like living light. Her crystalline body refracted and bent the emergency lighting, creating 1,000 confusing reflections. Guards fired at shadows while the real silicate slipped past them, her touch shattering control panels and door locks. She had been an engineer before captivity, and she remembered every system she had helped build before humans decided her people were too useful as experimental subjects. Granite did not bother with stealth. The Titanid simply walked through walls, his stone-like body impervious to shock weapons. He freed prisoners as he went, ripping open cells with his massive hands. Some prisoners ran, some stayed and fought, Some simply collapsed, too broken by years of torture to process their sudden freedom. Granite carried those ones, gentle despite his size, placing them in safe corners before returning to the fight. Navigator led groups of escaped phosphors through the darkness, their bioluminescence creating patterns that only their species could interpret. They moved like schools of fish, dozens of small beings working as one organism. Guards who tried to stop them found themselves suddenly blind, their vision overwhelmed by strobing light. By the time they recovered, the phosphors were gone, and through it all moved Iskar and Margaret. They ran through corridors Margaret had mapped during her months of nocturnal exploration. Iskar moved with terrible grace, his body finally free from chains and starvation. He did not kill. Even now, even with 5 years of torture behind him, he held to his species' nature. He disarmed guards with precise strikes that shattered weapons but left bones intact. He blocked corridors with his body, allowing other prisoners to escape past him. When guards tried to flank him, Margaret was there with stolen shock weapons, firing with the steady hands of someone who had nothing left to fear. The stimulants in her system burned bright, pushing her body beyond its limits. She knew she was running on borrowed time, but she only needed a few more hours. Just long enough to reach Lab 2. Just long enough to start the broadcast. They found other prisoners along the way. A group of avian seekers huddled in a storage room, their wings clipped but their spirits unbroken. A pair of aquatic drifters trapped in 2 small tanks, gasping but alive. Margaret freed them all, pointed them toward the emergency shuttle bays, and kept moving. The station's security finally organized a proper response. Blast doors slammed shut throughout the facility, dividing it into sections. Automated defense systems came online, turrets emerging from ceiling mounts. The guards stopped trying to fight prisoners hand to hand and instead fell back to defensible positions, using distance and firepower to control corridors. "We are running out of time," Iskar said as they crouched behind an overturned equipment cart. Turret fire screamed overhead, superheating the air. "They will lock down Lab 2 before we can reach it." "Then we need a bigger distraction," Margaret replied. She pulled out her stolen data pad and accessed the communication network she had built. "How many prisoners are still fighting?" "Most of them," Iskar said. "But they are scattered, unorganized. Without coordination, security will pick them off one by one." Margaret began typing rapidly. "Then let us give them coordination." She sent a signal through her network, a simple message that appeared on every hijacked medical monitor throughout the station. One word, repeated in 17 languages. Armory. The station's main weapons storage was 3 levels down, heavily secured but not impregnable. Margaret had found it weeks ago during her explorations. More importantly, she had found the ventilation route that connected to it, a path too small for guards in combat armor, but perfect for smaller species. The response was immediate. Phosphors converged on the armory, their light patterns now visible throughout the station as they moved in force. Crystal joined them, using her unique physiology to bypass the lock systems. Within minutes, freed prisoners were arming themselves with military-grade weapons, and the nature of the fight changed. Security forces found themselves facing not a prison riot but an organized assault. Former soldiers among the prisoners took command, beings who remembered their training from before captivity. They moved in squads using cover and suppression fire, advancing through the station with deadly efficiency. "Now," Margaret said, "while they are focused on the armory, we move now." They ran. Margaret's legs burned. Her chest ached, but the stimulants kept her moving. Iskar stayed close, his presence both shield and weapon. They encountered guards twice. The first group Iskar handled with brutal efficiency, his clawed hands disarming and disabling in seconds. The second group fell to Margaret's stolen shock weapon before they could raise an alarm. Lab 2's entrance appeared ahead. The door was sealed, but Margaret had planned for this. She pulled out a data chip and inserted it into the access panel. Her pre-programmed hack executed in seconds and the door slid open. Inside, the lab was empty. The scientists had evacuated during the initial power failure, following safety protocols. Their research remained, however, tanks full of living subjects, screens displaying experimental data, and in the center of the room, the main computer terminal with its direct connection to the station's broadcast array. Margaret ran to the terminal and began working. Her fingers flew across the keys, accessing the files she had prepared, loading them into the transmission queue. Behind her, Iskar sealed the door and began barricading it with lab equipment. "How long?" he asked. 2 minutes to prep, then 30 seconds to transmit the first data burst, Margaret replied. After that, they cannot stop it. The automated sequence will keep broadcasting until the entire database is uploaded. They will try to destroy the communication array. They will fail. I routed the broadcast through every antenna on the station. They would have to destroy the entire outer hull to stop it. The terminal beeped. Ready to transmit. Margaret's hand hovered over the execute command. This was it. The point of no return. Once she started the broadcast, everyone would know. Humanity would know what had been done in their name. The galaxy would know what humanity was capable of. She pressed the button. Data began streaming out into the void, carried on radio waves and quantum channels. Every frequency, every bandwidth, a flood of information that spread faster than the station could react. Evidence of genocide, records of experiments, names of the guilty, recordings of Margaret's testimony and documentation from dozens of prisoners. The truth set free. Alarms blared in the lab. Someone had realized what was happening. Margaret could hear explosions in the distance, the sound of security forces trying to shut down communication arrays. Too late. The first burst had transmitted. The automated sequence was running. In stations and colonies across human space, receivers were picking up the signal. People were watching. People were learning. The barricaded door shook as something massive slammed into it from outside. Once, twice, the metal began to buckle. "We need to leave," Iskar said urgently. "Not yet," Margaret replied. She was downloading one final file, the complete list of every prisoner who had died in this station. Names and species, dates and causes of death. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be mourned. The download completed. Margaret grabbed the data chip and turned toward the emergency exit at the back of the lab. The door exploded inward. Through the smoke walked General Iris Hawthorne, encased in military-grade combat armor. Her powered suit stood 3 meters tall, bristling with weapons. Behind her, a squad of guards in similar armor formed a wall of metal and firepower. "How touching," Hawthorne said, her voice amplified by speakers. "The traitor and the monster, working together to destroy humanity's security. You realize what you have done? The weapons developed here were meant to protect our species. You have just crippled our defenses against a hostile galaxy." "Protect?" Margaret said. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "You murdered 17 billion draconites for mining rights. You have been exterminating species and calling it protection. If this is what humanity has become, then maybe we do not deserve protection." "You are a fool," Hawthorne replied. "The galaxy is not kind. Species fight for survival. The strong endure. The weak are consumed. We are strong." "No," Iskar said, moving to stand beside Margaret. "You are afraid. Fear makes you cruel. Cruelty makes you weak. That is why you will lose." Hawthorne raised her armor's primary weapon, a plasma cannon that could vaporize a person in an instant. "Last words?" Margaret smiled. Behind Hawthorne, visible through the broken door, she could see freed prisoners converging on the lab. Crystal's light reflecting from 100 surfaces. Granite's massive form shaking the floor with each step. Navigators swarm casting rainbow patterns across the walls. And more. Dozens more prisoners who had once been helpless but were helpless no longer. "Yes," Margaret said. "Duck!" She and Iskar dropped to the floor as the prisoners opened fire. The lab erupted in chaos. Plasma bolts and shock weapons filled the air. Hawthorne's squad returned fire, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. The general's armor absorbed hits that would have killed anyone else, but even advanced technology had limits. Margaret crawled toward the emergency exit while battle raged around her. The stimulants were wearing off now, pain returning in waves. Her vision blurred. Blood was coming from her nose, she could taste it. But she was still moving, still fighting. Iskar grabbed her, shielding her with his body as an explosion rocked the lab. They tumbled through the emergency exit together into a maintenance corridor. Behind them, Margaret could hear Hawthorne screaming orders, could hear the sounds of armor breaking under sustained assault. They ran. Margaret did not know where she was going anymore, just that she had to keep moving. Had to stay alive long enough to make sure the broadcast finished. Had to witness the ending she had started. They emerged into the station's main shuttle bay. Dozens of freed prisoners were already there, loading into evacuation craft. When they saw Iskar and Margaret, they began to cheer. The sound echoed through the bay, a chorus of species who had been silent for too long. "Shuttle 7 is prepped and ready," Crystal said, her voice chiming like glass bells. "We are the last ones. Everyone else is away." "Then let us leave this place," Iskar said. He lifted Margaret gently, carrying her toward the shuttle. She wanted to protest that she could walk, but her legs had stopped obeying her. They were almost to the shuttle when the bay doors exploded inward. General Hawthorne stood in the opening, her armor battered and smoking but still functional. Half her face was visible where the helmet had been torn away, blood streaming from a wound on her scalp. "You die here," Hawthorne said. She raised her weapon, targeting Iskar. Time seemed to slow. Margaret saw the weapon charging, saw the inevitable moment approaching. Iskar could not move fast enough while carrying her. If he dropped her to fight, Hawthorne would kill her instead. There was no escape. No way out. Unless... Margaret twisted in Iskar's arms and threw herself at Hawthorne. It was not a tactical move. It was not planned. It was simply a nurse's instinct to put herself between a patient and harm. She collided with the armored general as the weapon fired. The plasma bolt meant for Iskar hit Margaret instead. She felt the heat, felt her body come apart at the molecular level, felt everything that made her herself scatter into nothing. Her last thought was satisfaction. The broadcast was complete. The truth was out, and Iskar was still alive. That was enough. The moment Margaret's body dissolved, something in Iskar broke that had survived 5 years of torture intact. He made a sound that had no name in any language, a keening wail of grief that froze every being in the shuttle bay. For the first time in his captivity, for the first time since his world burned, Iskar stopped trying to hold on to his species' pacifist nature. He set Margaret's medical bag down gently where her body had been. Then he moved. Hawthorne never saw him coming. One moment she was standing victorious, plasma cannon still glowing hot. The next, Iskar's clawed hand had closed around her armored throat. The metal crumpled like paper. Her weapon fell from nerveless fingers. She was unarmed, Iskar said, his voice terrible in its quietness. She was dying already. "She saved my life knowing it would cost her own, and you killed her anyway." Hawthorne tried to speak, but her vocal systems were crushed. Her armor's defensive protocols fired. Electric shocks meant to repel attackers. Iskar did not even flinch. The pain meant nothing. Nothing meant anything anymore except the broken body of an old woman who had shown him that humans could be more than monsters. "I told her I could not kill without it destroying me," Iskar continued. "That every death I cause I feel as my own." She understood. She accepted that burden for me. His grip tightened. "Now I will carry 2 deaths, hers and yours." He snapped Hawthorne's neck with a single motion. The general's body went limp. The powered armor suddenly a very expensive coffin. Iskar dropped her and staggered, feeling the death wash through him. It was worse than the 3 guards years ago. Worse than anything he had imagined. He felt Hawthorne's consciousness flicker and die, felt the exact moment when life became nothing and a part of his own soul died with her. He fell to his knees beside Margaret's medical bag. Crystal approached carefully, her crystalline body dim with grief. "We need to go," she said softly. "The station will destroy itself." Margaret set the reactor to overload before we reach the bay. "We have minutes." Iskar picked up the medical bag. His hands were shaking. He let Crystal and Granite lead him to the shuttle, his mind fractured by 2 deaths and 1 world-shaking loss. They sealed the shuttle and launched, joining the stream of evacuation craft fleeing the dying station. Behind them, Station Nightfall erupted in a cascade of explosions. The reactor went critical exactly as Margaret had programmed it, and the entire facility vanished in a brief sun. With it died the remaining guards, the laboratories, and all physical evidence of what had happened there. But the evidence that mattered was already spreading across the galaxy. The first civilian networks received Margaret's broadcast within an hour of transmission. At first, people thought it was propaganda. Enemy action meant to discredit humanity's military. But the evidence was too detailed, too comprehensive. The data included genetic samples, video footage, personal logs from scientists who had never intended their work to be seen publicly. Within 6 hours, independent investigators had verified the transmission's authenticity. Within 12 hours, humanity's civilian government was in collapse. The military tried to deny everything. They claimed the evidence was falsified, that prisoners had constructed elaborate lies, that this was all part of an alien plot to weaken humanity. But Margaret had been thorough. She had included financial records showing where funding came from, communication logs revealing who gave orders, and testimony from human guards who had witnessed the atrocities. Most damning of all were Margaret's own recordings. Her calm, professional voice describing what she had seen, naming names, providing context. She did not rage or accuse. She simply documented, the way a nurse documents a patient's condition. That clinical precision made her testimony impossible to dismiss. People listened to an old woman describe torture chambers and mass graves, and they believed her. They believed her because she sounded like their grandmother, their aunt, their mother. She sounded like someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others, and now she was telling them that humanity had lost its way. The galaxy's response was swift and brutal. Trade routes closed. Diplomatic relations severed. Human colonies suddenly found themselves isolated, their supply lines cut. The Galactic Council issued an ultimatum: dismantle the weapons programs, surrender those responsible for war crimes, or face complete quarantine from civilized space. Humanity had no choice but to comply. The military command structure crumbled as officers turned on each other, each trying to escape responsibility. 47 high-ranking officials were arrested in the first week. General Iris Hawthorne was declared dead in the station's destruction, but her name became synonymous with evil throughout human space. The survivors from Station Nightfall scattered to sanctuaries across the galaxy. Iskar and the other Draconites were offered a choice. They could live in protected reserves, or they could integrate into galactic society as ambassadors. Most chose integration. After losing everything, they wanted to ensure it never happened again. Iskar chose to become a speaker. He traveled to human colonies and alien worlds, carrying Margaret's medical bag with him always, telling the story of an old nurse who had refused to look away from suffering. He spoke at universities and government assemblies, in schools and refugee camps. Everywhere he went, he told people about Margaret Derry and the sacrifice that had changed everything. The first year after the uprising was chaos. Humanity's government restructured completely, civilian control replacing military authority. The Prosperity Initiative was shut down, the mining operations halted. Reparations were negotiated for species that had suffered under human expansion. It was not enough, could never be enough, but it was a start. Margaret's daughter Patricia watched the broadcasts with the rest of humanity. She saw the evidence of what her mother had discovered, saw the recording her mother had made. She read the letter Margaret had written, the one asking her to teach students to question, to never accept cruelty as necessary. Patricia quit her teaching job and became an activist. She founded an organization dedicated to investigating human rights abuses in space exploration. She gave speeches about her mother, about the importance of individual conscience over institutional authority. She was not alone. Thousands of humans, horrified by what had been done in their name, joined movements for reform and reconciliation. But change was slow and painful. Not everyone accepted the new reality. Extremist groups formed, claiming that humanity had been right to expand aggressively, that the galaxy was hostile and only strength mattered. They called Margaret a traitor. They called Iskar a monster. They bombed refugee centers and attacked alien embassies. Iskar spoke at one such bombing site, standing in the ruins where 12 phosphors had died in an extremist attack. He held Margaret's medical bag and told the gathered crowd about the woman who had treated his wounds, who had risked everything to expose the truth, who had died protecting him. Margaret once told me that humanity's greatest strength was not weapons or technology, Iskar said. She said it was the human capacity for compassion, for seeing suffering and choosing to ease it. She proved that truth with her life. These bombers, these extremists, they prove her point as well. They show what happens when humans forget compassion. They show what happens when fear and hate replace mercy. He opened the medical bag and pulled out a stethoscope, Margaret's personal one, worn from decades of use. She listened to hearts. She heard them beating and knew that each beat mattered, each life had value. That was her revolution. Not violence, not revenge, just the simple recognition that every being deserves to be treated with dignity. That is what she died for. That is what we must remember. 20 years passed. The galaxy slowly healed. though scars remained. Memorial sites were erected on dozens of worlds, listing the names of those who had died in humanity's expansion. The Draconite people numbered only 312 survivors, but they endured. Some clutches were rebuilt. New generations hatched, growing up in a galaxy that remembered what had been lost. On Earth, a statue was erected in Margaret's honor. It showed an old woman kneeling, her hands reaching out in healing. The inscription read, "Margaret Derry, righteous among the stars." She saw a patient where others saw a weapon. She saved us all by refusing to look away. Iskar visited the statue on the anniversary of her death. He came every year without fail. He would stand before the bronze figure and tell it about the changes in the galaxy, about the treaties signed and the progress made. He would tell it about the children, both human and alien, who were growing up learning about her story in school. On the 20th anniversary, a human child approached him. She was young, maybe 8 years old, clutching a school data pad that displayed an image of Station Nightfall. "Are you really Iskar?" the child asked. "The one from the stories?" "I am," Iskar replied. "My teacher said you were in a cell with a monster. She said you were very brave." Iskar looked down at the child. She had dark eyes, curious and unafraid, a generation that did not remember the old hatreds. "There was a monster in that cell," he said carefully. "But it was not me." "Who was it?" the child asked. Iskar knelt down, bringing his massive frame to the child's level. "The monster was the cage itself," he said. "And the system that built it. The people who thought that some lives mattered less than others. That was the monster. Margaret saw it when others could not. She fought it when others would not. And she won. Because she was strong? Because she was kind," Iskar corrected. "Strength without kindness is just cruelty. Margaret taught me that. She taught all of us." The child considered this. Then she placed a flower at the base of the statue, a simple gesture that children had been taught to do when visiting memorials. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Iskar watched the child run back to her parents. He placed his own offering at the statue, a tradition he had started years ago. A vial of water from his homeworld salvaged from the ruins mixed with soil from Earth. 2 worlds blended together. A reminder that unity was possible, even after terrible division. He stood and looked up at Margaret's bronze face. It captured her expression perfectly, that combination of determination and compassion that had defined her. The sculptor had been one of the freed prisoners, a being whose species communicated through art. They had known Margaret for only a few days, but those days had been enough to understand who she was. "The galaxy is better now," Iskar said quietly. "Not perfect. Not healed, but better. Children grow up learning about you, about why one person's choice to do the right thing matters, about how courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it." He paused. "I wish you could see it. I wish you knew how many lives you touched, how many beings live free because you refused to accept cruelty as inevitable." A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of flowers from the memorial garden. Iskar imagined he could hear Margaret's voice in it, pragmatic and warm. "Did we do enough?" she had asked in those final moments. "Yes," Iskar said, to the wind, to the statue, to the memory of an old nurse who had changed everything. "You did everything." He picked up Margaret's medical bag, the leather worn smooth from 2 decades of carrying it across the galaxy. Inside were the same basic supplies she had brought into Cell 7. Bandages, antiseptic, painkillers, the tools of healing. He had never used them, could not bring himself to open the bag, but he carried them everywhere. They were a reminder, not of death, but of what humanity could be when it chose compassion over conquest, of what one person could accomplish when they refused to look away from suffering, of the old nurse who had walked into a dragon's cell and emerged having saved not one life, but countless millions. Margaret Derry had been sentenced to death for standing up to evil. Instead, she had sparked a revolution. She had reminded humanity of its better nature. She had proven that the greatest strength was not in domination, but in the courage to show mercy. The galaxy would remember her for centuries to come. Schools would teach about her. Songs would be written. History books would analyze her impact. But for Iskar, she would always be the small, gray-haired woman who looked at him and saw a patient, who treated his wounds with gentle hands, who refused to accept that some beings deserved to suffer. She had been his friend. She had been his savior. She had been, in the end, the best of what humanity could offer. And that, Iskar knew, was a legacy that would never die. He turned from the statue and walked back into the city, Margaret's medical bag secure in his hands. There was work to do. There were always beings who needed help, needed advocacy, needed someone to refuse to look away from their suffering. Margaret had taught him that. She had taught all of them. The galaxy was vast and there was much left to heal, but healing was possible. Margaret had proven it. One patient at a time, one act of compassion at a time, one choice to do right even when it cost everything. That was humanity's true strength. That was the hope she had given them all, and Iskar would carry that hope forward, as long as his heart still beat in honor of the nurse who had refused to see monsters where there were only people in need of care.